morning, everyone. Welcome to Future Places number 7. This is the beginning of a long journey, a 4-day journey, and we're very, very pleased to welcome you to the University of Porto, to the University of Porto Science and Technology Park, Creative Industries Incubator. First and foremost, I would like to outline that we're doing this for the 7th year in a row. It's a great pleasure and a great pride for us, a great source of pride. I'll say a few quick words about what we have in mind for this year. I trust you have the program with you, either the printed version or the online version. So I will really and essentially focus on the conceptual side of what brings together a bunch of very, very different and apparently dissonant activities. As usual, I would probably like to quickly deconstruct this future places. We use it as one single word for very practical reasons, because if you Google future places as 2 words, it's a little harder to get to. That's really the only reason. But it's also, I believe, an interesting starting point, because conceptually, the idea is indeed to bring the concept of the future and the concept of the location, where we are, and what can we do exactly where we are, and how can we actually envision and build some kind of future. We started 7 years ago in 2008, and by then we said that we were a digital media festival that talked about the relationship between digital media and local cultures. I think all of these terms still apply, but we've actually changed and have chosen in the meantime to apply others and to add other terms. Media lab and citizenship in particular, we believe have become a lot more relevant or visible than they maybe were 7 years ago. And why is that? Well, first and foremost, because we believe that the concept of the future itself has changed in the meantime. Back in 2008, it was quite easy to believe that technology was kind of promised land determinism. Everything was just going to be amazing with cloud computing and apps and mobile phones and everything. And of course, it's been great, nothing against technology and all of these developments. But how can we then reach a collective space, socially, culturally, historically, where the future is no longer that utopia that we kind of envisioned in 2008, but has meanwhile been replaced by a lot of anxiety, a lot of angst, the concept of catastrophe that seems to be going everywhere, viruses, both real, clinical, and digital, surveillance that we'll hear about in a minute in detail. And we get to 2014 and the future is no longer what it used to be, to quote some kind of cliche that someone said sometime. So what is it in 2014? Well, I believe that we're actually beginning to look beyond that sense of angst, that sense that we've reached some kind of dead end. I believe that we're actually seeing the first signs of us in kind of an emerging poise. What I these days call a benevolent anger. There's something in the air that is asking us to do something about it. And Future Places has become at least an attempt to do something about it. Therefore, the media and citizenship mission that we established in 2008 still applies, and I dare say probably more so these days than actually in the beginning. We're very proud of that. Why open it with a research symposium and the words of Gillian York? Because we believe that first and foremost, research at this point in history needs to be about action and the reversion of knowledge, in this case scientific knowledge, to society at large. You probably remember a video game that was, and maybe is still, I'm not sure, quite popular a few years ago, Guitar Hero. Right? So it's an application of some kind where you perform like a guitar star and you'll learn how to play like Axl Rose or something. No, Axl Rose doesn't play. Slash. Slash will do, right? What we're doing this morning across, on the other building across from here, is actually creating the concept of the guitar anti-hero. 11 people who have never played guitar in their lives will get together and produce a concert that will be performed tonight. They've never met before, and they've never really touched a guitar with the intention of getting on stage. But they're taking the brave step of actually getting on stage tonight. And this takes an act of faith, but it's also an act of anger. It's a way of saying, let's be disruptive in a creative way, because we do believe that we need to explore further territories. So these two locations, these two places, to go back to the concept of future places now, I think these two kinds of extremes of research that we should keep in mind these days. Your PhD projects, they will be taking 3 to 4 years. Some of you are way down the line. Some of you are just getting started. But yes, it's about perseverance, and it's about slow processes of discovery and revelation. At the same time, there's also a space for urgency. There's a space for revelation to happen in the space of 10 hours. Therefore, you're invited for the concert tonight to find out what these 11 guitar anti-heroes are cooked up together during the day. A few reminders. We've kindly invited you to stick to 10 minutes in your presentation, under the belief that really it's about presenting a visiting card, and actually the most fruitful time can probably happen during the discussion of your work. Obviously, we're a bit flexible, but yes, it's really about convergence rather than just presenting the projects one by one, therefore saving as much space as possible to actual discussion. I'll shut up now because it's really about Karen Gustafsson, Julian York, Nuno Correia, who has also kindly provided the program in association with Carolina Henrich, who cannot be with us. Anyway, enjoy. It's good to be here, and I hope we all survive until Saturday, because it's going to rock. Karen.
Well, welcome everyone. I'm Karen Gustafsson. I'm from the University of Texas at Austin. I've met many of you, but not all of you, so I look forward to that. I'm program manager for digital media there for the UT Austin Portugal program. And today I'm going to be introducing our opening speaker. We have been very fortunate every year in attracting fantastic speakers. And this year we have Jillian York, who is the Director for International Freedom of Expression for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I had to write that down because I always get it out of order. Me too. That's comforting. She is an activist and a writer for major publications, including Foreign Policy and Slate and The Guardian, on subjects including surveillance and corporate and government efforts to control content on the internet, as well as on digital media and journalism. She's run workshops around the world. And one of the things I particularly like about her work is the way that she teases out perspectives on and implications of different policy issues. And she can speak very critically about them, but she also has, I think, a great sense of pragmatism and optimism, which I think fits really well with what you were just talking about. It's a benevolent anger. So she will be speaking to us today on the chilling effects of surveillance, and I think that will be followed by kind of a quick Q&A period. And she will also be speaking tomorrow on a panel. 9:30. 9:30.
Thank you so much. And I hope you don't mind if I sit, because I didn't print out my notes, so. All right. So, my password. Okay, well, good morning, and thank you so much for having me. Thank you to the University of Texas Austin, and thank you to Future Places Festival. And I'm really excited to be back in Porto. I've been here one time before. So I want to ask a question first, and I'm going to ask it without prompting. I'd like you to raise your hand if you think that you have nothing to hide. Anyone? One. Okay, 3. There's always a couple. Okay, good. Well, I'm going to ask the question again at the end. So we've learned a lot in the past year. Now, I'll talk a little bit about my organization, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from and my perspective on this. When the Snowden revelations broke, I was actually in Tunisia for a conference, and I think actually that day I was probably on the beach enjoying myself. And I learned from looking at my email on my phone, and there were all of these conversations happening in my office and on our office email list. And my first thought was, I wonder how many people are actually surprised by this. People in my office, but also people out in the world. And what I found was that, so the Electronic Frontier Foundation has been suing the NSA since 2006. We had a whistleblower come into our office many years ago, probably 2004 or 2005. I'm not going to get the date right, but this was Mark Klein, if you're familiar with the story. And he was able to demonstrate to us that AT&T, one of our major telecoms, was colluding with the NSA on warrantless wiretapping, so wiretapping their phones with no legal order. And so we had a lot of cynics in the office. We had people who, when they went out to lunch to have a conversation, would take their batteries out of their phones. We had a lot of people that might be described as, I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but wearing tinfoil hats. Have you ever heard this term? Yeah? So kind of a crazy paranoid idea. And then we had genuinely some people who felt like they had nothing to hide. And what we found with the Snowden revelations was that really everyone, I wouldn't say was surprised, but there was still some shock in the office that things had gone that far. And then when I looked to the public reaction, first on Twitter and in my circles, my social circles, and found that, yes, a lot of the journalists and other people that I know, and maybe who work in the foreign policy space, the people in Washington, D.C., they also had a similar reaction, shocked that it had gone this far. But when I started to look at the public, the broader public reaction, what I saw was a lot of people saying, well, I have nothing to hide, or we have to fight terrorism, or, insert your own argument here. There were a lot of arguments basically saying that this was not a big deal. So what? They're watching us. I have nothing to hide. So I understand this perspective. I live my life pretty openly. If you know me online, you know that I talk about everything. I'm not really a private person individually. But at the same time, my reaction last year when we saw the Snowden revelations was fear. So historically, surveillance has been targeted. If you look to some of the most surveilled societies in the past, even when you think about, former East Germany or the Soviet Union, still a lot of that surveillance was targeted. Typically, even if you had someone following you, even if you had someone watching you that closely, you were identified as a suspect, let's say, and you were followed and targeted as such. But as the cost of surveillance has decreased, surveillance is very cheap these days, so as the cost has decreased, the amount of surveillance has increased. We've gone from targeted surveillance to mass dragnet surveillance, where everyone, no matter who they are or what they're doing, is a target. So back to that idea of nothing to hide. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, everyone is guilty of something or has something to conceal. All one has to do is look hard enough to find what it is. So okay, let's say you have nothing to hide. In the US, where I'm from, we have 27,000 pages of federal laws. The federal government actually does not know how many federal laws there are. There have been some really interesting quotes about that, where someone says, oh, I think it's about 10,000, or what have you. But the fact is, you, as an individual, probably can't know all of them. By the way, there's a funny Twitter account that's been trying to post every single federal law in the US. I think they're about a fifth of the way. So, Moxie Marlinspike is a developer, and I'm a big fan of his. He developed TextSecure, if you're familiar with the app, Open Whisper Systems. He wrote last year, shortly after the Snowden revelations, that if the federal government can't even count how many laws there are, what chance does an individual have of being certain that they're not acting in violation of one of them? And he used a really funny, in my opinion, example about lobsters. So I'm from New Hampshire in the northeast of the US, and lobster is one of our favorite foods there. And apparently there's a law that you cannot be in possession of a lobster under a certain size. If you are, you're violating the law. And you could potentially go to jail for that. I don't know if anyone does, but nevertheless. So I started thinking about some of these laws. For example, in Australia, it's against the law to eat whale meat. So imagine you're an Australian and you travel to Japan and you decide to partake in this alleged delicacy that we probably shouldn't be eating anyway, but that's beside the point. And then you post it to Facebook. So the point is, there are implications to everything that we do. Furthermore, though, this argument that we have nothing to hide implies that all laws are just and that we should just accept things the way that they are. And as Heitor said, this benevolent anger, this feeling that something's not quite right, drives us to try to change things. But change, historically, has always happened with illegal activity, and let's just accept that fact. Galileo was convicted for heresy for believing that the earth revolved around the sun. And we've known for a long time because of that, and because of other great thinkers, that dangerous ideas can get us into trouble. And so we organize behind closed doors in private spaces. Well, what if those spaces have back doors? And what if we are being watched in everything that we do? A society that is constantly watched can never progress. And so surveillance has implications not only for our individual privacy, but also for progress, for innovation. And then the knowledge, or even the perception that we're being surveilled, can have a chilling effect. In 2012, so before the Snowden revelations, there was an industry study conducted by the World Economic Forum that looked at a set of high internet penetration countries. And I can't define what they are specifically, but basically these were countries where internet penetration was above 50%. A majority of respondents to the study, so 50.2%, believe that in 2012, that the government monitors what people do on the internet. Okay, so people were already thinking this, of course. And at the same time, only 50% of those same respondents believe that the internet is a safe place for expressing their opinions. 60.7% agreed that people who go online put their privacy at risk. So we were already thinking about this before our fears were confirmed. And then last year, at the end of the year, after people had had some time to digest, PEN, which is the International Writers Group, their American Center in New York did a study of their members, so all professional writers in some capacity, and found that since the publication of the first NSA leaks, 28% of those writers have curtailed or avoided social media activities. Another 24% have deliberately avoided certain topics in phone or email conversations. And then what scares me the most is that a full 16% of those respondents said that they have avoided writing or speaking on certain topics. And when further questioned on that, some of those topics included the conflict in Israel and Palestine, the Iraq War. Basically, these were typically issues of national security in the US, or considered to be. So surveillance affects us in a number of ways. Not only does it infringe on our personal freedoms and our privacy, it submits us to state control, and it prevents us from progressing as a society. But when we talk about it, when we talk about this idea of nothing to hide, when we talk about the impact of surveillance, we typically focus on privacy. And I have a real problem with this because of the statistics that I've just talked about and other things that I'm going to address in a moment. I think that, yes, privacy is very important. Privacy is paramount, perhaps. But privacy differs from society to society. I'm going to give you the worst example, but yet the best example of this. When you use the toilet in most of Europe, the door reaches all the way to the floor. In the US, it reaches to about here. The point is, the conception of privacy in that respect is very different. People in the US think of this in one way, people in Europe think of it as another way. And the same goes for a number of different aspects of society. That's just one very obvious example to me. And people talk about it a lot, oddly enough. So the point is that privacy differs from all over the world, but speech, our concept of what is free speech might differ, but the importance of speech does not differ. And so the opposition of surveillance is not only born out of a desire for privacy. It also comes from a desire to feel safe saying what we want to say and talking to whomever we want to talk to without fear of reprisal. Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights provides for the right to freedom of opinion and expression, to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. And yet, the internet is being treated as a separate space. You wouldn't dream of the government watching everyone in their bedrooms, and yet they deem it acceptable in the US and many other places to watch everything that we do online. Documents leaked by Edward Snowden have demonstrated the extraordinary breadth of the US and other governments' mass surveillance programs. And these programs obviously constitute an intrusion into private lives. And the violation of privacy, as I've said, is obvious. Indiscriminate mass surveillance goes against that basic fundamental right. The negative effects of surveillance on the fundamental freedoms of expression and association are less obvious to the general public. We don't think about it. We don't think about the ways in which our speech is chilled. And yet, the UN is thinking about this. Frank LaRue, who just won our Pioneer Award this year, just a couple weeks ago, and who is, or I think he's leaving his post soon, I'm not sure if he has yet, who is the Special Rapporteur to the UN on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of expression and opinion. Whew, that's a long title. He talked about this. He discussed the ways that mass surveillance can harm expression. He wrote that undue interference with individuals' privacy can both directly and indirectly limit the free development and exchange of ideas. And an example that he gave, restrictions of anonymity in communication, for example, have an evident chilling effect on victims of all forms of violence and abuse who may be reluctant to report for fear of double victimization. Now, historically, both myself and my organization have often talked about those people in the distant places, those people whose anonymity is important because they're fighting against their government or because whatever. But lately we've started to think about it in ways that are closer to home, and I think that that's a perfect example. A victim of violence, a victim of domestic abuse might need anonymity, and yet all of the forces that be seem to be trying to restrict that. And the harmful effects of surveillance on expression and association are undeniably linked. The right to organize is imperative for political expression and the advancement of ideas. It can also be imperative for ensuring our freedom. I'm going to give you an example, historic example. So in the US, when the South was still under Jim Crow segregation, the state of Alabama sought ways to shut down some of the organizing against that. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, still called that despite the anachronism of the term, was founded in 1909. And in the 50s and 60s, they were trying to fight back against segregation in the South. Alabama, the state of Alabama, a rather conservative state then and now, tried to shut that down. And as part of its strategy, they required that organization, the NAACP, to reveal to the state's attorney general the names and addresses of all of its members and agents operating in Alabama. Obviously, and I think we can all see that as obviously a violation of freedom of association. And when the NAACP refused to do this, Alabama sued them. But they fought back, and in 1958, there was a court case, NAACP versus Alabama, where the Supreme Court of the US held that if the state forced the NAACP to turn over those member lists, its members' right to assemble and organize would be violated. And this case set the precedent for the Supreme Court's foray into the constitutionally guaranteed right to association after decades of government attempts to shun disloyal individuals. And I'll just give you one quote from that, from Justice John Marshall Harlan. This court has recognized the vital relationship between freedom to associate and privacy in one's associations. Compelled disclosure of membership in an organization engaged in advocacy of particular beliefs is of the same order. Inviolability of privacy in group association may, in many circumstances, be indispensable to preservation of freedom of association, particularly where where a group espouses dissident beliefs. So this case has been settled, all done and dusted, and yet, what the NSA is doing now in looking at our digital communications steps right back into that territory. So last year, the EFF filed a lawsuit where we had, I want to say 19, but I could be wrong, co-defendants coming together in this same fight These organizations ranged from the Unitarian Church to gun rights associations. So it was a wide spread of organizations, and what they all have in common is that they have membership, they have members, and they're all fighting to protect the freedom of association of their members. And so this was the first case that we've had against the NSA that was addressing the First Amendment, freedom of expression and association, rather than the Fourth, privacy. So the data collected by the NSA's various surveillance programs poses a similar threat to the threat posed to the NAACP in the 60s or 50s by the state of Alabama. The vast majority of what the NSA collects is metadata. Everyone familiar with the term? Metadata, okay, good. It's an ambiguous term, of course, but in this case describes the data surrounding one's communications. So that is to say that if the contents of one's phone call is the data, the metadata can include the number that's called, the time of the call, and the location from which a call was made. Now, it's not content, and that's been one of the biggest arguments in favor of surveillance. We're not looking at content, we're only looking at metadata. And yet, I think that there's a very good argument to be made that metadata is, in effect, content. It can, in effect, be used against a person. Imagine, for example, that you make a phone call, or you find out that you have some disease, and you make a phone call to your doctor, and then you make a phone call to your insurance company, and then you make another phone call to your friend. Those different calls can be pieced together in a way that a reasonable person could look at and decide sort of what's going on there, piece those different things together, and make determinations about what you're doing and what you're affected by. And so the danger in metadata is that it allows the surveiller to map our networks and activities and makes us think twice before communicating with a certain group or individual. In a surveillance state, which I think we're headed into in the US anyway, and certainly in the UK, and definitely in Australia, less so in other parts of Europe at the moment, but nevertheless, in a surveillance state, this can have profound implications. Think of Uganda, for example, right now, where a legal crackdown on LGBT activists is currently underway. So if Uganda was the kind of surveillance society that the US has become, a gay youth seeking community or health care faces significant risks just for the simple act of making a phone call. In many countries, there's been a long legal distinction between the content of the message, so the message itself, and the communications data or the metadata. This distinction is based on the traditional model of postal mail, where information written on the outside of an envelope is public or distinguished from the content inside the envelope. But this distinction is rendered nearly meaningless by modern surveillance methods, which can capture far more than the destination of a communication, as I've mentioned, and can capture all of our communications, not just certain ones. In order to argue effectively for and reclaim the right to associate freely without surveillance, it's imperative that we make that distinction. Digital metadata is different from analog metadata, and its wide-scale capture creates a chilling effect. It's time for fresh thinking on the impact of the culture of surveillance on our daily habits. Now, I want to talk just a little bit about the changes that we've started to make as a society, because I think that that's really what we're talking about here. How have we started to harness this benevolent anger? I love this term. How have we started to harness this, and what are we doing to try to fight back? So our interactions have undoubtedly changed in the past year as a result of our knowledge of mass surveillance. Fortunately, though, fear and withdrawal are not the only reactions. I think our habits are changing as well. In September 2013, the Pew Center, you know the Pew Center, I assume, did a study of the ways in which people had reacted to the knowledge of mass surveillance, and found that 86% of internet users have taken steps to remove or mask their digital footprints. So this could be anything ranging from clearing cookies in a browser to encrypting their email. Another 55% of users have taken steps to avoid observation by specific people, organizations, or the government, or companies. I think it's fair to note that corporations play a big role in this, but I'm not going to focus on that today. But corporations are also reacting in positive ways, to a certain degree. I'm still very wary of them, and I think that that's a fair position to take. But they're also responding to increased public awareness and responding to their customers. In early 2013, before the Snowden revelations, encrypted traffic accounted for only 2.29% of all peak hour traffic in North America. Now it's 3.8%, so small change. In Europe and Latin America, the increase in encrypted traffic is much more stark. 1.47% at the beginning of the year to 6.10% in Europe, and 1.8% to 10.3% in Latin America. That's a huge shift. And it's also telling that journalism organizations have stepped up in the wake of the Snowden revelations, and then putting into place systems that will protect future whistleblowers. So perhaps you've heard of some of these new platforms like SecureDrop and Global Leaks, both of which are trying to reach out to publications all over the world to ensure that whistleblowers have a secure way to leak content or to blow the whistle. Jill Abramson, who until recently was the executive director of the New York Times, stated in 2013 that surveillance has put a chill on really what's a healthy discourse between journalists and our sources, and it's sources who risk going to prison. So I give a lot of talks to journalists, and journalists are sometimes the first people to say, I have nothing to hide, because journalists are brave people. They put their lives on the line all the time to report what's happening all over the world. And yet, a lot of times they're not thinking about the impact that this has on their sources, on the people that provide them with the information. And I think that what Abramson said is perfect. It's the sources who are at real risk, typically, not the journalists. Although the New York Times and James Risen shows us that journalists are at risk as well. And so this realization has led to several publications, so far including The Guardian and The Washington Post, and we're going to see a lot more soon, implementing whistleblower platforms. Similarly, the public discussion around the use of encryption is also growing. So can I get a show of hands who uses any sort of end-to-end encryption? I can explain what that means if you don't know, but just for starters, who uses anything, can be any kind. Okay, not bad. Who doesn't know what end-to-end encryption is and wants me to explain it? Okay, great. So I'm gonna give you the non-technical version, and I apologize if there's any technical people in the audience who are gonna criticize me for this one, but basically it goes like this. So you know what HTTPS or SSL is? Okay, so whenever you do banking online or use Gmail, you've got that little, it says HTTPS instead of HTTP, you've got the little lock, and basically that kind of encryption protects people from outside, hackers, anybody who would want to spy on you, governments, assuming that they don't have a cooperation with that company. It protects any of those people from spying on what you're doing. And so that's a fairly good form of protection if your adversary is not a company or a government that's cooperating with a company. So if you just want to protect yourself on a Wi-Fi network, you're good. But end-to-end encryption goes a step further and protects us not only from those outside people, but even the intermediary. So if I'm using PGP, for example, which is a form of end-to-end encryption for email, if I'm using that, I'm not only protecting my email from the government and from hackers and from other people, I'm also protecting it from my telecom and the company who provides my email. And so the only people who can read it are me and the recipient. And there are other things too. I mentioned Text Secure earlier for your mobile phone, for SMS and data chatting. And there's bunches more. I'm happy to point you in the right direction if that's something that interests you. In fact, tomorrow EFF is launching a project that gives you all of that information. So far in English, Spanish, and Arabic, but we're going to have Portuguese coming soon as well. Anyway, the point was the public discussion around this encryption is growing. And so we've seen numbers of people adopt some of these tools, but I will say that the tools are still difficult to use. The good news there is that developers are also responding by trying to find easier ways to bring these tools to the masses, basically. And governmental and quasi-governmental organizations, including the State Department in the US, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which is historically our propaganda department, but nowadays has a little bit of a different role, as well as nonprofits, are increasing funding toward tools that can be used to thwart surveillance attempts. It's kind of funny from an American perspective to see the two hands of government, one doing the surveillance and the other one paying organizations that want to build tools to fight surveillance. But I think that that just shows dissonance, not nefariousness. So the Pew study that I mentioned a little while ago found that 68% of users, internet users rather, believe that laws are insufficient in protecting their privacy online, that the law is not the only means to conquer this. And I agree with that. So we've seen numerous attempts to globally affect change through legal and political channels. EFF was a contributor to something called the 13 Principles for the Application of Human Rights to Communication Surveillance. Just call them the 13 Principles. And those were developed prior to the Snowden revelations. They provide a framework for policymaking at the state level and focus on making surveillance targeted, necessary, and proportionate. Absolutely opposed to mass surveillance in any capacity. And this is a good tool. It's been used effectively so far in Argentina to try to push laws there. And one of my colleagues right now is in Colombia trying to do the same thing. But the law, in my opinion, is not enough. There are a bunch of other changes that we have to make as well. So I think I talked a little bit about technical changes, ways in which we can take control over the surveillance that's pervading our lives and fight back individually. And I believe that technology is the only way that we can do that on an individual level. But at the same time, I think that there are two other areas. One, of course, being, well, I guess one other area, because I said law and policy in the same sentence, didn't I? So we've got law, we've got policy, we've got technology, and then the fourth one, which I think fits perfectly into the theme of the festival. And that is that I think that we have to change culture. So I'm going to ask again, who still feels that they have nothing to hide? Still one. Okay, there's always one. It's okay. I haven't convinced you. But honestly, I think the point that I would make to you, and I'm sorry to call you out, it's not personal. Whenever I talk to someone who says that they have nothing to hide, what I remind them is that it's not just about you. You may not have anything to hide, and you may feel completely comfortable giving me your credit cards, your banking information, your health records, and assuming that I'm not going to do anything to hurt you with those, and I won't. But, as I said about journalists and their sources, it's also about us, the people that we connect with. So I said I've got nothing to hide, and I really don't have a whole lot to hide. But I talk to people in Syria, I talk to people in Iran, just two examples. I talk to people who have a lot to hide and for good reason. And so even though I might not care about keeping myself safe, it's important, it's imperative that I care about keeping those other people safe as well. And so I think what really needs to happen is a cultural shift toward recognizing that. A cultural shift toward recognizing that privacy is important, but also that surveillance can impact our lives in so many other ways. It can prevent us from speaking freely, it can prevent us from associating freely, and it also can prevent us from innovating and progressing as a society. So, I'm going to conclude there, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Julian, I'm going to challenge you right away.
Okay.
I didn't raise my hand because I wasn't sure what to say. I think there's a further concept that I would like to discuss with you. And I'm aware of the fact that I might be stepping into parallel territory. I think there's a dynamic here that could be explored.
Okay.
I feel that I don't have something to hide as much as I have maybe something to preserve, which is slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
Slightly less ideological, or slightly less political, possibly more ideological. In this, I think Andrew Keen has written recently, defending not so much the issue of privacy as much as the issue of introspection, and saying that this pervasive transparency is ultimately damaging to the individual and his or her own ability to define themselves internally in their own terms. Can we connect these two terms, hiding and preserving?
Absolutely. I think that both apply, so I'm going to start with that premise. Okay, I'm going to tell you a personal story. A few days ago, it was the weekend, and I'm guessing, given the number of academics in the room, that you're familiar with the idea of just working through the weekend. Everyone's done that? So I have a bad habit of doing this. Even if it's with a bottle of wine on a Saturday night, I'm still writing, I'm still working. And this past weekend, I chose to completely avoid that entirely. I laid in bed, I watched movies, I went out to dinner, I didn't touch my computer. And at the end of the weekend, on Sunday night, I allowed myself a little moment to prepare for the coming week. And on Sunday night, the first thing that I wanted to do was tweet that I'd had a real weekend. And I stopped myself. Because I thought, why do I need to announce that? Why can't this be my, and I know I've just told all of you, please don't tweet it now, but why can't I keep that to myself? Why can't I treasure that?
Yeah.
And so I think that these two concepts absolutely connect. And I think that they're separate, but they're also wrapped up in the idea of, as you said, preservation. I've also heard control over one's own life, one's own destiny, protection of one's family. And so on the nothing to hide side, there's some organizing that I may or may not be involved in at some point where I do feel like I need to hide that from the government actively.
Yeah.
Whereas the idea of protecting my personal interest and protecting my weekend and not sharing that with the world, that's absolutely preservation. And it's privacy. It's not privacy in the sense that I demand it from the government. It's privacy in the sense that you don't need to know what I did with my weekend, and that's okay. And so I do think that those concepts absolutely intertwine, but I don't think that we should focus too much on trying to push them together, because I think that the implications of my sharing aspects of my personal life are not as severe as the implications of what happens when I do this organizing out in the open.
But my point is, June, if you allow me to just go further a little bit, and then obviously a lot of other people want to talk, but I believe there's a reason to say that we may want to hide something in order to preserve it. Maybe there's an assumption that if we're hiding something, it's because we're ashamed of it or we're committing something illegal. How about simply wanting to preserve it and therefore hiding it? So I may have something to hide because I do want to preserve that space of introspection.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's where they felt that way.
Yeah, I agree, and I think an interesting example here, if I can diverge again for a moment, but this is in utter agreement with what you just said. I've been doing a lot of reading over the past couple of years of by basically Soviet historians, people who look at the history of the Soviet Union. And one of the things that has fascinated me about that is how much of those histories are based on memoirs that were written privately, meant probably never to be shared, and a lot of them by women, incidentally. And these memoirs provide like just a perfect history. And when I think about what's written inside those memoirs, if they had been intended for publication, and I mean, I do think it's okay that they're published now. It's many years have passed, everyone has passed on. But the idea that if those had been written as blogs, they would have been written in a completely different way. And so I'm actually very sad that today's activists are not writing these private memoirs, or at least not that we know of. Because I think that the way in which those are preserved, hidden from public view, not hidden because there's something to fear, although in that case there probably was, but hidden for the sense of preservation. Anyone else?
I raised my hand because
Sure.
I was distinguishing, like it was explaining, protection from hiding, hiding something. Is the same in your concept, or it's a different thing? Because protecting my data from my banking account, for example, it's one thing. Hiding something that it's dark, it's another thing in my concept. In your concept, is the same?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Data versus feelings, for example,
Ah,
right?
so I think it's different for one main reason. That doesn't mean it's completely different. In the security community, people often talk about threat modeling. The idea that to understand what you have to hide or what you have to protect, you have to think about who your adversary is. And so if I were to give you a training on how to use digital security tools, I would walk you through a set of questions where I would ask you, what is it that you want to protect? What's your asset? I hate all the lingo, but what are you trying to protect? Who are you trying to protect it from? How much are you willing to do to protect that information? And so what that does is it gets you to the point where you understand who you're trying to protect it from. So for me, my banking information, I'm actually not so worried about the government having that because I'm not doing anything illegal, I don't have much money in my account, and they're not going to steal it. But when I'm thinking about my banking information, I'm probably thinking about thieves, people who want to steal my money. And so I think that that's where it differs, because protection for the sake of preservation of privacy or of information it's more personal. It's not because you necessarily have an adversary. It's not because someone wants to steal it. It's because you want to keep it to yourself or whatever. Whereas the protection of banking information serves a purpose. which is not to say the other thing serves a purpose, sorry, I said that wrong. It serves a specific purpose of ensuring that you still have your money. And I think that that's the only way in which those really strongly differ, in that one is self-preservation, whereas the other is preservation from an external individual or organization. Does that hopefully answer the question? Anyone else?
What opinion do you have about surveillance in the healthcare industry?
To be honest, it's not something that I focus on very much, although my mother works in the healthcare industry, so I've had to think about it a little bit. And, you know, in the US we have this law that, HIPAA, what does HIPAA stand for? Do you know?
I know, it's HIPAA. HIPAA says that healthcare data is now on the patient's ownership.
Right.
Patients own their health data.
Yes, okay, yes. So one of the ways in which this is enforced is when you go to a pharmacy to pick up a prescription, there's a red line that you have to stand behind to pick up your prescription. It's almost very arbitrary because you can still hear the conversation that's going on. And so I think that it's been applied in this very literal sense of, okay, well if you're standing a meter or whatever behind this person, then everything is private. But that's obviously not the case. I've overheard many of these conversations. So I do think that it's important, but I think that the reason that it's important is because of the shape of society that we live in. If we lived in a society where people were not, what's the right word here? Where people were not at risk for having a certain disease. So in the US, for example, with our healthcare system, or our lack of healthcare system, if you prefer, if you have and this may not be true now, I'm not up to date since I don't live in the US anymore, but basically before Obamacare, if you had a prior condition, what is the term for this? I'm completely losing my language here. Pre-existing condition. So if you had a disease already, a pre-existing condition, then it would be harder to get insurance. And therefore, that information, if your insurer found out about it, could be held against you, could raise your costs, etc. And so that's what I mean by the shape of society that we live in. When we live in a society where our health problems are stigmatized or are, cause financial trouble, then healthcare privacy is of utmost importance. Whereas if we live in a society where people with HIV are not discriminated against, or costs can't be raised because you have cancer, then healthcare privacy becomes less important. That is not to say that it's not something we want to preserve. I think that, you know, it's up to you how much of that information you want to share, and so it falls into that category of self-preservation, of choice. But I think that the society that we live in now means that there are very, very good reasons why someone would not want a government, an insurer, or a private company to find out that information. And I think that that's true about a lot of those other things that I talked about too, like the Galileo example. Right now, scientific ideas are not persecuted. You can, in the US, you can go out and say that the sun revolves around the earth, and you can say that on Fox News and nobody cares. True. Yes. And so that idea is not persecuted anymore, so no one has anything to hide when it comes to that. But we do have things to hide when it comes to, organizing for Palestine in the US right now. There have been a number of grand juries, trials, attempts to silence that community. And that's just one example. But I think that those ideas shift in time, and what's legal today could be illegal tomorrow. What's persecuted today could be persecuted tomorrow. And that's part of the reason why I think that we need to be thinking about this holistically, and not just getting rid of surveillance, but also changing the shape of society at the same time so that these ideas are not stigmatized.
I'm very concerned about the topic you presented, but a month ago I was talking with a friend and he told me that no one cares about my personal data. Advertising companies or government companies, they are just concerned about getting data, and we are just members. They don't care about our personal data. what you think about it. Do you think that we are numbers, or that we really have to fight for these?
I think on scale, we are numbers. So there's very little chance. So let's assume for a moment, because we don't know all of the details, but let's assume for a moment, for the sake of argument, that the NSA is collecting data on every single individual all over the world and putting that in some database. Just an assumption. In that sense, we are numbers, because not only do they not care about looking after every single person, they can't. On scale, it's impossible. Even if every single person had committed a crime, crimes are always prioritized. And you can see that, for example, in the prosecution of drugs, drug possession in the US. Certain drugs are prosecuted at a higher level than other drugs. So police, law enforcement, whatever, they always make priorities. That said, I think that what I just said a moment ago before your question is kind of my answer to this, which is that the priorities change. So in the 1950s, the priority in the United States was anti-communism. We have to get rid of this scourge on the earth. And so we'll fund whatever people it takes to fight back. The irony of this, of course, is that the Nobel Prize was just awarded to somebody who identifies with the Communist Party and is being persecuted by that same party that we funded back then. So there's always these shifts in what's acceptable and what's not. Sorry if that was a weird, obscure example, but it's in my head for a few days. And so I think that just because we're numbers doesn't mean that those risks don't still apply. And we've already seen how metadata can be used to prosecute certain people. Now, is it happening at large scale? No. In fact, the number of actual consequences from national security, from NSA surveillance over the past couple of years is still, a drop in the ocean, of one grain of sand. But that doesn't mean that couldn't change, and it doesn't mean that it couldn't be you.
I think that's all the time that we
Yeah.
have right now, but you're invited to continue the conversation outside. We're going to have a quick, about a 5-minute break, and we'll start with the research.
Thank you.